Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to class 7 of the Art of Self-Coaching, our class on unhappiness. As usual, let me just begin by offering some suggestions, some best practices with regard to Zoom to allow you to get the most out of this class. You can submit questions via the Q&A function during my remarks, and then I'll make sure that we have time for me to address your questions at the end of class. You can use side-by-side mode for optimal layout because there's relatively little text on my slides, and you can expand the video, which will allow you to perhaps see a little bit more clearly. If you have any feedback either on the Zoom logistics or any other topic, please email me here. I will read everything, I guarantee. I will do my best to respond, but I may not be able to. A reminder about partner conversations. You're going to need to interact with your partner in real time during class, and that can be in person if it's someone living with you, or via phone or a separate video call if that's if in person isn't possible. Today, in general, I'd like you to experiment with the coaching process. Today, I'm going to have you get in and out of a series of conversations with your partner that need not be coaching conversations. In fact, they're going to be relatively brief conversations. So the coaching methodology itself may be less useful in that context. I'd really rather encourage you to simply share what you're feeling and share what these exercises, what we'll be working on today, evokes for you. There'll be an on-screen timer during these conversations. Use that to stay on track and come back to the main room when we're concluded. So, in talking about unhappiness, I want to remind you of some of the challenges that we highlighted with the word happiness in the English language that we touched on a few weeks ago. Happiness often conveys a sense of, let's call it superficial pleasure. And that's not what the positive psychologists were aiming at, although that often gets characterized as happiness studies. And, what they're really aiming at is ultimately in the word from the Greek, eudaimonia, a deeper sense of meaning and fulfillment, the highest human aim. There's also a challenge with the word unhappiness in the English language because it's a negation. And what do we really mean by it? Do we simply mean the absence of happiness? And although I deliberately use the word because I think it's a useful bookend and also highlights some of the linguistic challenges we face here, I'd like you to think of it as a legitimate feeling in and of itself, not really the absence of happiness, and more specifically, a fruitful state. I believe that there are some things we can learn when we are unhappy that are unavailable to us during other circumstances. That doesn't mean there's necessarily a silver lining, but I think it's important not to simply try to banish happiness from our lives. That's a fruitless enterprise in most circumstances, but I think it also results in some missed opportunities. Here's our agenda. We're going to conduct the opening exercise that will be teed up by the responses in the survey that I asked you to complete. I'm going to have you debrief that with your partner. Then we're going into a series of exercises that will repeat that process. I'll ask you to take some notes, and then you'll have a conversation with your partner. Then we'll come back near the end of class. I'll have some overarching remarks, and we'll conclude with your questions and a few thoughts for our class on next time. So with that, let me step into this exercise, and I'm going to stop the screen share momentarily. Okay, and take a few minutes and respond and share with you what you shared with me. I asked you to share a source of unhappiness in your life, and here's what I heard. Here's what you shared. Not feeling I'm good enough at work. Not receiving a grant I was counting on to keep my organization afloat and people paid. An existential dread I feel for the world. It is an anxiety always in the back of my head. My husband is caught abroad because he does not have the right visa and cannot return during COVID immigration nightmare. I don't think I can pinpoint a source of unhappiness that isn't providing a degree of wisdom and learning that I can rejoice in. I wasted so many opportunities. I haven't made meaningful progress toward my goal of becoming an entrepreneur. Not being able to be physically close with my loved ones was hard previously. Now that international travel seems impossible, it is even harder. I still haven't found the right co-founder for my startup. I fear that I'm not good at influencing people. Since quarantine started, my job has turned much more demanding because of the lack of organization in the home office. Career uncertainty. Whether the effort I put into my job is truly aligned to my pursuit of my passions and use of my gifts in life. To wake up and find that my husband of 36 years was dead. After 11 months, I still have not regained my enthusiasm for life. Different views toward what is safe in COVID-19 environment and implications of family dynamics as a result. My job was made redundant in March. Coupled with the quarantine conditions of coronavirus, the bleak outlook for the world and myself professionally are at the forefront of my mind. Not being able to see my family and friends in person. Being away from my family. My work is unstable and I haven't found a job that I enjoy and is profitable. My current health condition. Having to cancel my upcoming wedding in August. That I have to devote most of my time to work and not to my hobbies. Passive aggression in my family takes over all gatherings. My partner of 5+ years broke up with me with no warning. Although I feel so fortunate, I cannot shake this feeling of loneliness and isolation. There is an enormous sense of guilt that I should be grateful, but I am mourning the life I feel like I once had and the physical closeness to people I love. Challenges with mental health and feeling like I am not making progress despite repeated efforts. Even though I am quite successful in what I do professionally, it feels as if I don't actually like what I do, while others around me see me as a happy person who keeps constantly achieving what I want. I feel unhappy about not having it figured out when so many other people my age seem to have the big pieces of their life settled. My relationship with my brother. I find it extremely difficult to interact with him, likely a result of unresolved trauma on both our parts. My fiance passed away in a tragic accident just 7 weeks before our wedding, throwing my entire personal and professional life into question. I resigned from a startup I didn't believe in, and I then got laid off from a startup on the verge of collapsing. My parents are older and no longer as able or vibrant as they once were. Both are less happy in their old age, complaining often, even when I try to comfort them. My company's mission no longer aligns with the type of impact I want to make in life. I wish I could quit tomorrow, but I do not feel that it is appropriate as I have loans to repay and need health benefits. Comparing myself to others. A sinking feeling that I'm on the wrong path and don't find meaning in my work. My relationship with my family causes unhappiness for me. On my worst days, I worry that they will one day die, or I will, and I will not have had the relationship I deeply crave with them. Toxic romantic relationships. Separation of family contact and having to postpone daughter's wedding and miss birth of son's son. My emotion dysregulation combined with perfectionism. My partner and I are 4 months pregnant with our first child. At our most recent ultrasound, the doctor observed an abnormality that might suggest a heart defect or a genetic issue. I recently got a pay cut due to COVID-19, and I'm feeling like a more worthless person, knowing how much less I'm making relative to my classmates. Uncertainty about my personal and professional future. I'm trying to start a company, and it's been frustratingly difficult to find a co-founder and simultaneously make progress on the product vision. My anxiety around a challenging leader in my company who lectures me, speaks down to me, and I worry is going to hurt my career. My projection that my partner wants more than I can give. My loneliness and single life. I crave long-term romantic relationship, and I fear not being able to attain that. The inability to feel useful, stretched, and valued beyond my role as a parent and spouse. trying to match somebody's expectations, losing my father. My spouse doesn't share my enthusiasm. The issue has persisted for years without change, regardless of communicating and talking through the problem. Stress from managing the relationship with my co-founder, which went bitter. We went from being friends to being antagonists. I created a company with a friend and I perceive him as not being capable of turning it around. The feeling of going backwards, not forwards. This is aggravated by the fact that I don't know what goal I want to work towards to start moving forwards again. I work in live music. Like so many people in other industries, I fear that it may never return in the same way. My relationship with my body and skin. I have a wonderful life, but I am unhappy about my writing. I doubt myself, lose sight of where I'm going, get overwhelmed. I feel frozen. Since my divorce, it is hard for me to get in contact with my children. Feeling powerless about the discrimination and oppression that Black communities face in the United States. How few friends I have in the city in which I live. I am scared of trying to make more. I have no idea what career or work I'd like to do in my life. Unable to find a sense of belonging. So what I'd like you to do now is have a conversation with your partner. I'm gonna put our slides back up and frame this conversation. And I'd like you to simply talk with your partner about what that evoked for you, what it was like to witness all the sources of unhappiness that are with us today. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Take just 6 minutes here and have that conversation with your partner. I will be back with you in 6 minutes. All right, welcome back. Wherever you are in your conversation with your partner, I'm going to have to ask you to hit pause so we can move on into the series of exercises that I have teed up. And before we do, I find this line from author Wendy Moss useful to bear in mind after a conversation like that. Recognizing that all of that we just discussed and so much that I didn't have time and space to discuss, so many additional submissions to that survey that I wasn't able to share because of the limits on our time together today, was always with us. It has always been with us every time we've gotten together over the last 7 weeks. And I find it very useful to bear that in mind whenever I'm in a group, when I'm talking to people virtually or together, when I'm back together again with a group of people in a room, to just bear in mind how much is there and to allow that to influence how I show up with people and how I empathize with them. So with that, I want to push on into a series of exercises, and I want to remind you of this image from early on in the course. I'm going to present you with a series of exercises which will then tee up conversations that you have with your partner. And in both the exercises and the conversations with your partner, I want you to be very mindful of the choices that you're making and encourage yourself, invite yourself to be a little bit more vulnerable, to do the thing that feels a little bit more challenging to do. And I'm not in the least encouraging you or to do the thing that feels most vulnerable or to push yourself to the absolute limit. That's not the point here. The point is simply to be mindful of the choices that you're making and to recognize there's probably a little bit more to learn if you push yourself to be a little bit more candid, a little bit more vulnerable. And you want to be mindful of your comfort zone. You want to get a little bit outside of it and not too far. So let me provide you a little bit with a little logistical guidance here. You're going to need pen and paper, as I advised you in our preparatory email for today's class. I'm going to be asking you to take some notes. Those notes are personal documents, and I want you that you're not going to be required to share them in any way. Then what you write down is for your own use. But I want you to be explicit and detailed in making these notes, because in so doing, you're going to evoke a stronger emotional response. And what we're talking about are emotional experiences, not merely cognitive. That said, I also want you to proceed slowly in this first exercise. Do not begin with COVID-19 related issues because we're going to take a series of steps here. If you go too far too quickly, the exercise gets unnecessarily difficult. So with that, presumably you already have pen and paper and are able to take some notes for yourself. The first exercise is negative visualization, or the premeditation of evils, as the Stoics referred to it. So what I'd like you to do is take a minute and think of something bad that might happen to you, something real that might happen, and make some notes about it. Be explicit, be detailed, be personal. Take about 30 seconds, and then we will move on. Okay, that chime is the signal to hit pause. So I want you to just put down your pen for a minute and reset. And now I'd like you to consider what you just wrote and think about something that might happen that's even worse. Something real, something that might happen to you. And I'd like you to make some notes about it. Be explicit, be detailed. Write this down for yourself. Take another 30 seconds, and then we'll move on. Okay, once again, I want you to hit pause in the note-taking and reflect. And think about something even worse that might happen to you. And I'd like you to take some notes on it. Be explicit, be detailed, be personal. Take another 30 seconds and write down some notes about something worse that might happen to you. Okay, for the fourth and final time, and by now you should know what's coming, and this is also why I encouraged you to start slowly in this exercise. But once more, I want you to think about something even worse, something that might happen to you. Make a few notes. Be explicit, be detailed. Take 30 seconds, and then we'll move on. Okay, now I'm going to have a conversation with your partner, and I want to use the conversation that you just had as a model here. You take 8 minutes, and it need not be a coaching conversation. I want you to simply share with each other, what did that evoke for me? What am I thinking and feeling as a result of that journey through a series of negative experiences that might occur? So when you take 8 minutes, have this conversation with your partner. I'll be back here in 8 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Wherever you are in your conversation with your partner, I'm going to have to ask you to hit pause, but you will be back in a dialogue with them very soon. So that was, a very brief dive into Stoicism. And I think one of the most powerful lines from that school of thought is from Marcus Aurelius. Things do not touch the soul. Our perturbations come only from the opinion which is within, which reminds me of the power of mental models, the ways in which our interpretations are assumptions about a given set of circumstances deeply inform and affect our emotional response to those circumstances. So with that, I want to move into our second exercise. And this is a photograph of the same family taken 40 years apart. And I find it very evocative. It stirs up a lot of thoughts and feelings for me, and hopefully it does for you as well, because it's going to form the basis of this next exercise. So I want you to imagine that in the context of taking this class, we have discovered the secret of time travel, and we are able to take a series of trips into the future together. And I want you to be prepared to propel yourself mentally into a certain point in the future and be able to envision your state of mind at that time. So our first trip into the future is about to begin. And it is now 40 years into the future. I'm 52. I don't expect to live to 92. Living in my mid 90s seems unlikely and isn't even necessarily an aspiration of mine, but let's assume I've made it. And however old you are, let's assume that you have made it as well. It is 40 years in the future, 40 years from today. What I want you to do is take some notes and make a list of the things that you're worried about. It's 40 years from today. What are you worried about? What are you concerned about? Take about 45 seconds and make that list. Okay, once again, I want you to hit pause on the note taking, and let's reset the time machine and prepare ourselves to take another trip into the future. And it's now 20 years into the future, 20 years from today. I am in my mid 70s, which is an aspiration I have. I would like to make it to my mid 70s, survive COVID-19 and all the other obstacles in my way. I am hopefully retired on a ranch in Sonoma somewhere. Maybe you are too. Or maybe you're in the height of your career. Maybe you are in the midst of the work that you've aspired to pursue. But it's 20 years from today. What are you worried about? What are you concerned about? Make a list. Take 45 seconds. Okay, once more, I want you to reset. We're going to return to the present day and prepare ourselves to take another shorter trip into the future. It's 2 months from now. It's the middle of July. What are you worried about? What are you concerned about? Take 45 seconds, make a list. Okay, for the final time, I have to ask you to hit pause in your note-taking and prepare ourselves for one last trip into the future, an even shorter one. It's 2 days from now. It's Monday. What are you worried about? What are you concerned about? Take 45 seconds, make one more list. Okay, now I'd like you to have another conversation with your partner. Tee it up in the same way we've been so far. What did that evoke for me? What am I thinking and feeling as a result of these series of reflections on my worries and concerns at various points in the future? Take 8 minutes, have this conversation with your partner. I'll see you back here in 8 minutes. Welcome back. And wherever you are, once again, I have to ask you to hit pause in your conversation with your partner. And in an oblique way, that was an exploration of some aspects of Buddhist thought. And I am reminded of one of my favorite lines from Pema Chodron. This is the view of the Atlantic Ocean from Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia, where she has been the abbess for many years. Maybe the most important teaching is to lighten up and relax. And can we zoom out from the concerns and the anxieties and fears that we are wrestling with at any given moment, and take a larger perspective and put them in perspective by thinking about what we are worried and concerned about over the course of our lifetimes, not merely today. And I hesitated, I ordinarily, I use this slide under ordinary circumstances, and I wondered, should I continue to use it under the circumstances in which we find ourselves today, life under quarantine for many of us and life under COVID-19. And I actually think it's more relevant than ever. And I'll come back to that thought before the end of class. But with that, I want to transition into our third and final partner exercise of today. And in this conversation, I want you to take yourself back into the future, back into the past, then locate yourself in the present, then put yourself into the future. And we're going to start by going back into your past. I want you to think about a source of suffering in your past. The situation is over. The circumstances are no longer causing suffering, but you can recall them. You have a sense of how you suffered. Maybe it's related to something that I read at the beginning of class, or maybe something that I read at the beginning of class is reminding you of a past situation, but the suffering is concluded. And what I want you to do is take a minute and write down some notes about what you learned. What did that suffering teach you? Take a minute. Okay, I want you to hit pause in your note-taking, and now locate yourself in the present moment, what you are experiencing and living through today. And I want you to think about a source of suffering. Maybe it's big, maybe it's small. Maybe it's related to something that I read at the beginning of class, or something that I read at the beginning of class reminds you of this current, present, live source of suffering in your life. And I want you to take a minute and take some notes. What is it teaching you? What are you learning? Take a minute. Okay, for the final time, I would like you to hit pause in your note-taking and relocate yourself in time. Now I'd like you to project yourself into the future. And I want you to think about an inevitable source of suffering that is coming down the tracks and headed towards you. And I'd like you to actually think beyond COVID-19 and life under these current circumstances, because so much about COVID-19 is uncertain and unpredictable. We have a sense of how it's going to affect us, but we don't know for sure. And I'd like you to look beyond that, look into the future and think about an inevitable source of suffering. Something is going to happen. We can't prevent it. And I want you to think about what it might teach you. What might this source of suffering teach you? What do you hope to learn? Take one more minute, take some notes. Okay, for the third and last time today, I want you to have a conversation with your partner, having journeyed from the past to the present into the future and reflected on lessons learned, lessons you might learn. I want you to take another 8 minutes, have this conversation yet again with your partner. What did that evoke for me? What am I thinking and feeling as a result? I'll see you back here in 8 minutes. All right, welcome back for the last time. That was in a sense, an exploration of the work of Viktor Frankl, the great Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, whose work I think has an immense amount to teach us today. And he encourages us to look for the meaning in suffering, not in the least suggesting that it is a silver lining or that it makes suffering worthwhile, or that there is necessarily a reason for that suffering, although there are many belief structures that encourage us to think that way. But I think Frankl tells us, even in the midst of suffering, there is an opportunity to find meaning. And I think a pathway to that is to understand, what can we learn from it? What is it teaching us? So with that, I want to encourage you to shift your energy a little bit. A number of, a wide range of cultural traditions encourage us to approach grave topics in a lighthearted spirit. One that is meaningful to me is the tradition in New Orleans, Louisiana, a city I've visited many times and has a great deal of resonance with me, of conducting funeral processions in a very joyous way. And because we have been exploring a series of grave topics that have undoubtedly evoked a series of strong, difficult emotions, and because in 23 minutes, you need to move on with your day and with your life, and you may need to be in a very different state of mind, I want you to just deliberately shift the energy for a moment. If you're sitting down, stand up, take some deep breaths, shake it off a little bit. I don't want to leave these topics behind, but I do want to put you in a slightly different state of mind so that you can be prepared to address them in the context of what you're going to do throughout the rest of today and this weekend. And I also want to remind you, as always, to thank your partner and express some appreciation for the work that you've been doing with this person over the course of the last 45 minutes. I'm going to take a few minutes and provide a little some framing remarks for today's conversation, and then conclude with some questions, some of which you've posed already, and now is also a good opportunity to avail yourself of the Q&A function, ask some questions. I'll try to integrate them and respond to as many as possible at the conclusion of class. First, I just want to emphasize, we've taken a very shallow dive into three incredibly deep schools of thought that you could spend literally a lifetime pursuing. And I'm in no means suggesting that our work over the course of the reading this past week or today in any way comes close to exhausting what is to be learned from these traditions. But hopefully, by beginning that process of exploration, or taking it a little bit further, if there are schools of thought that you've already been exploring, hopefully it's encourage you to see some connections between these various schools of thought and positive psychology, which has in many ways formed the backbone of this course. We can often think about the distinctions between these longstanding spiritual and philosophical traditions that deeply inform the human experience. And we think of the contrast with positive psychology and other more contemporary sources of wisdom. But I would like you to think about the connections and the parallels. Positive psychology is not, it's not about this, it's not the study of happiness. It's really ultimately the study of meaning and fulfillment. And that's also deeply true about all of these schools of thought we explored today. Positive psychology offers a variety of tools to allow us to pursue emotion regulation. And the concept of emotion regulation, even if that term isn't deliberately used in the schools of thought that we explored today, still remains very core to all of them. Positive psychology also explicitly invites us to surface and interrogate and challenge our mental models, the beliefs and assumptions and interpretations that we bring to a given set of circumstances or experiences that inform our emotional response to those experiences, as do all of the schools of thought that we explored today. I also think it's important to acknowledge some limitations of positive psychology and some downsides. It can often be framed and interpreted as an effort to banish unhappiness. And as we know simply by reflecting on the vignettes that I read at the beginning of class, that is not possible. It is not possible to banish unhappiness for our lives, nor would I suggest is it a fruitful effort, simply because it is so inevitable. And if we strive, if we're interpreting the guidance of positive psychology as an effort to banish unhappiness, then we are going to leave ourselves woefully unprepared when happiness inevitably strikes us. And we may fail, we may miss opportunities to learn something uniquely valuable in the process. I'd also like you to remind you of a reading from Christopher Peterson. I encouraged folks to explore his book. I don't have permission to use that copyrighted material, but he is a positive psychologist who was very influential in the development of the VIA, played a very leading role alongside Martin Seligman in that process. And he, he frames it as positive psychology can often be interpreted as blaming the victim. If positive psychology offers a chance for us to exert agency and influence our state of well-being and happiness, then when we inevitably find ourselves unhappy, we may say, oh, I am responsible. And while positive psychology, I think, encourages us in a fruitful way to take greater responsibility and see opportunities for agency in our lives, including particularly the ways in which some small-scale intentional activities allow us to deliberately elevate our state of subjective well-being, as we explored several weeks ago in the class on happiness. It is also impossible for us to continue to exert agency indefinitely. There are limits on human agency, as I think is very, vividly illustrated by the vignettes that I read at the beginning of class. There are limits on agency. And so important to us, for us also to explore the ways in which positive psychology must be augmented by wisdom from other schools of thought. And I encourage you to look to additional spiritual and philosophical traditions for that wisdom that may augment what we can learn from positive psychology. Saying a little bit more about Stoicism in particular, and here in a variety of ways, the most influential, perhaps greatest Stoic, Marcus Aurelius. Critical to bear in mind that we use Stoicism in a kind of lowercase s way in English, and that's not really what we're talking about here. Also, that equanimity that Stoicism encourages us to pursue is not weary resignation. It's not passivity. The Stoics were not passive people. The Stoics were quite active in their efforts to influence and shape the world around them. And look at some connections here. From the Stoic perspective, happiness is equanimity and tranquility, which I think bears a close relationship to the positives, to the concept in positive psychology of eudaimonia. Again, positive psychology is not about mere pleasure, but about a deeper sense of meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. Stoicism encourages us to turn toward negative emotions and look at the connection with a growth mindset. Under the conditions that evoke a growth mindset, it's less troubling, it's less triggering to be presented with evidence of mistakes and setbacks, and so it therefore becomes easier to turn towards those negative emotions. Also, Stoicism tells us very vividly, our distress stems from our beliefs and judgments, our desire for things to be different or to be a certain way, which is deeply connected to or a manifestation of the mental models that we bring to our life circumstances. And ultimately, Stoicism can be interpreted as an effort, in Oliver Burkeman's, I think, vivid phrase, to turn infinite fears into finite ones, which is merely another way of describing the process of emotion regulation. Let's also talk a little bit about Buddhist thought and its connections here. Another line from Pema Chodron that I find quite meaningful: seeking pleasure is an opportunity to observe what we do in the face of pain. And given the inevitability of pain and suffering and unhappiness in our lives, can we cultivate the capacity to resist what she calls the addiction to avoiding pain? Can we cultivate comfort with discomfort, another manifestation of emotion regulation? Can we be inquisitive and open to experience? A powerful way of describing mindfulness. She then also goes on to say what we call obstacles are really the way the world teaches us where we're stuck. So what are the mental models we're bringing to a set of experiences? We want things to be a certain way. We perceive a set of circumstances that are different than those desires as to be obstacles. And yet, can we view them as learning opportunities? There's also a connection here with a growth mindset. If things are not going our way, if we find ourselves defeated or at least held back by a series of obstacles, can we ask ourselves what is to be learned from them in that process? And she also challenges, I think, quite deeply. Death is wanting to have every experience confirm you and congratulate you and make you feel completely together. And we can view that very literally in the era of COVID-19, but I think it's also important to view it more broadly under ordinary circumstances, and recognizing how stifling and static it can be to seek to be comforted and rewarded, and what we miss as a result, and how that can be connected with this idea of from Carol Dweck's work of a fixed mindset, under which we are actually striving to avoid discomfort, and find ourselves rewarded and affirmed, and as a consequence may fail to take some necessary risks and stretch and push ourselves to grow. And then looking once more at Viktor Frankl's work in the field of logotherapy, he lets us know everywhere we are confronted with the chance of achieving something through our own suffering. And he's very clear about emphasizing this is not to suggest in the least that suffering is to be tolerated if it can be alleviated, but rather to understand what can be achieved through it, what learning can be had from these unique experiences, and is there meaning that it can impart to life as a result. It's also important, I think, to note, and I alluded to this in our class on happiness, Frankl takes this, very strong stance. Happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. It must grow out of our life circumstances. Is this at odds with positive psychology? Potentially, it can be. But it also remind us that positive psychology is not encouraging us to pursue mere pleasure. Positive psychology is encouraging us to look for a deeper sense of meaning, of eudaimonia. And positive psychology is encouraging us to take agency and responsibility while recognizing that there are limits on the agency that we can exert in our lives. I think that's very consistent with Frankl's worldview in lots of ways. I'm not suggesting they are entirely in parallel and consistent all the time, but rather than viewing them at odds, I think it's important to see ways in which they might reinforce each other. So with that, let me take a moment and get myself oriented and be able to take some time and answer your questions. And some of them have been submitted already, and I will respond to them. And then others have just been submitted. And what I'm going to do is stop sharing the slides and pull up the Q&A response and talk briefly about the first. Let me just respond. Somebody noted in the first exercise, the negative visualization episode, the premeditation of evils, that I don't like putting bad juju into the universe. I feel like I'm going to bring it into reality. And I want to acknowledge that is a response that's common. Every time I've conducted this exercise with my students, somebody has felt that in some way, shape, or form. And I'm not, I'm not here to tell you, oh, that's impossible. That can't necessarily happen. I mean, I think that steps into spiritual territory that's beyond the purview of my expertise as an executive coach. And I think it's also important to recognize it's a form of a mental model, of a set of assumptions that one brings to a given set of circumstances that informs our emotional response to those circumstances. So even just recognizing, hey, under some circumstances, if I'm even envisioning something bad happening, that might be so distressing because I think I'm going to make it happen or influence what happens as a result, that I then, I choose not to think about it. I can't even I feel so uncomfortable that I can't even direct my attention towards it. I would suggest whatever we believe about our influence in the universe, that can be a severely limiting factor. And if we can cultivate some comfort with discomfort, we're going to be better able to turn our attention towards the inevitable sources of unhappiness and suffering that are coming our way. So question, how to apply Stoicism when the source of unhappiness is uncertainty? And I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what bad thing is going to result. So how can I apply it? Well, I'd say let's take a step back. What are the assumptions and mental models about what might happen? What are the assumptions and mental models about uncertainty itself? I'm reminded of a line from a great psychologist named Sheldon Kopp, whose work was very popular back in the 1970s and 80s. His line is very simple: control is an illusion. And we can view so many of the, so much of human behavior as an effort to exert control or to create the illusion of control. And I think so much of the suffering that we're undergoing now in an era of COVID-19 is that many of the tools that we use to create the illusion of control are stripped away. And simultaneously, things that we used to be able to control are less within our control. It's not merely the fact that we're less able to create the illusion of control. But so much of our lives is beyond our control, utterly beyond our control. And we find that quite disturbing. And we seek to solve for that by seeking to exert control and creating the illusion of certainty. That is, much of that is being deconstructed right now. And I'm not in the least callous or lacking empathy towards the way that is disturbing. I feel a great deal of that in my own life. It emerges in the lives of my clients on a regular basis, and finding ways to make our peace with that, to come to terms with that, to come to grips with the ways in which our efforts to exert control over the world around us are now being thwarted and resisted. I don't have a simple answer to that, but just even recognizing that we have this deep desire to exert control in the face of so little that we do control. And if we can even enhance our capacity, our comfort with discomfort, we're going to make it much easier on ourselves in our ability to ride through the difficulties that we're experiencing in the present moment. Also a question, how to deal with concerns that my problems are nothing relative to the more profound or serious or stressful sources of suffering that we observe others. And that was posed in response to hearing some of the vignettes at the beginning of class. And where that takes me is actually, it reminds me of the work I do in my practice. 2/3 of my clients are CEOs, and the remainder are very successful executives and investors. People who have enjoy many privileges and advantage in life, as do I. And in my work with them, both in terms of exploring the challenges that they're wrestling with, and as a result being more aware of my own, where I've landed is this kind of recognition that it is all true. These various sources of suffering do not cancel each other out. And while I think it's profoundly important to be able to step back and take perspective and be able to see our personal sources of suffering in that larger perspective, it's also important to recognize that we still experience those as sources of suffering. One of the reasons why senior leaders find it necessary to work with a coach is because there are very few places in which senior leaders are going to find it sort of safe to fully and freely explore the implications of that. A theme that I observe kind of in society at large is we tend not to empathize up. When we perceive somebody as enjoying a greater privilege or more advantage, we assume that their privileges and advantages preclude them from experiencing suffering. And that can be true in lots of ways. If we go back to the class on happiness and recognize, all right, there's certainly a correlation with material well-being, material wealth, and subjective well-being. And obviously, enjoying privileges and material advantages insulates us from all sorts of forms of suffering. And yet, we still experience suffering no matter what our position in society, or no matter what the advantages we enjoy. So, I think the challenge is living within the cognitive dissonance that this paradox evokes. Can I step back and look at my own sources of suffering and put them in perspective? Because inevitably, especially when you bear in mind the vignettes that I read at the beginning of class, other people are suffering far worse. In some sense, other people are suffering a set of circumstances that allow me to kind of recognize, like sources of my suffering right now. I'm actually better able to bear when I learn a little bit more and am more empathetic towards what other people are going through. And that doesn't mean that my suffering vanishes. It doesn't mean that it's not a source of suffering. And I think that's difficult to bear in mind, and yet quite important. In fact, perhaps one of the most important ideas in the context of this course. Let me look at a couple of additional questions here. Sometimes things happen that are shitty, period. And sometimes there is nothing to learn from it apart to accept it. And sometimes there is no meaning we can find to it, and that is okay. I don't disagree with that. Let me reemphasize, in seeking to learn from suffering. I'm not in the least suggesting that there's a silver lining or that it necessarily happened for a reason. But I do think, and deeply inspired by Frankl's work here, that there are opportunities for us to find meaning in suffering and to learn from it. And I think in some larger sense, given the inevitability of suffering in life, that is a way of finding meaning in life, which I think is particularly important now, which doesn't mean in the least that there's a silver lining, or that we should view this as a kind of exhortation to stop feeling bad. Suffering entails suffering. And I think, the effort to find some meaning and to learn from it, does not necessarily lessen the negative feelings that are a consequence of that. Question about what's the difference between emotion regulation and suppression? I would encourage you to go back to the class on emotion and some of the materials there, and recognize that suppression is essentially an effort to kind of distance ourselves from emotion and either ignore them or on a for some sort of sustained period of time imagine that we're not feeling them. And regulation entails acknowledging the feeling, both the physiological manifestations of the feeling, and labeling it to ourselves, giving it a word which allows us to then manage it more effectively, communicating that feeling either by verbalizing it with somebody else, allowing it to inform or influence our behavior, writing it, and doing so in ways that allow us to affect our goals. It doesn't mean preventing the emotion to sort of influence us or allow it to access how we're showing up in certain situations. And it's a fine distinction. It's not as if there's some black and white effort or black and white distinction between making the effort to regulate our feelings and completely suppress them. But we know that efforts to suppress emotion, to pretend that we're not experiencing it, or to ignore its impact on us, tend to be counterproductive. They can often make the emotion feel heightened as a result, and can actually have over a sustained period of time adverse health effects. So really important to bear in mind. I see that there are additional questions that I'm not able to respond to, but hopefully this started the process of encouraging you to think further about the ways in which the ideas that we explore today can augment the concepts from positive psychology that form the backbone of the class. And with that, I want to reshare the slides and provide you with a little bit of additional context for our next class. So our penultimate class on success. And let me just take a few minutes and tee that up. We are going to return briefly to the world of social psychology and the work of Sonia Lyubomirsky, who's going to talk about myths of happiness, things that we believe should make us happy and yet reliably do not, or at least not in a sustainable way. I'm also going to explore the work of David Foster Wallace, the late novelist and nonfiction writer, and look at it through the lens of values. And then there's an optional reading from the work of the great management thinker, Peter Drucker, one of the greatest management thinkers of the 20th century, on the concept of self-management. And there's an exercise that draws on Drucker's work, the Managing Oneself worksheet. What I'd like you to do is complete the worksheet after doing the assigned readings, the work by Lyubomirsky and David Foster Wallace. And then if you'd like to explore the ideas introduced in the worksheet a little bit further, the article by Peter Drucker is an optional reading. Video and slides from today will be posted on my site by tomorrow, perhaps sooner if that's possible. And last thing I'd like to say before concluding is I want to thank you for the trust. This is a slide that I shared in our very first session, indicating my aspirations that this will be a meaningful learning experience for you and your partner, and that my hope that you get something lasting value out of this. And I think that we take meaningful steps towards that by exploring topics like we did today in ways that are often difficult, that evoke difficult and unpleasant and uncomfortable emotions. And yet, if we're unable to do that, we deny ourselves so much learning We deny ourselves the opportunity to find meaning in the suffering that we inevitably experience in life. And our ability to do that work rests on trust. Your trust that this is going to be a good use of your time, your trust in me as a virtual instructor, and I would say most importantly, your trust in your partner, your trust in the person with whom you've been talking about this most meaningfully and intimately over the course of today. So my last encouragement is, again, to thank your partner for the difficult work that you did this morning. Okay, it is 11:31. I apologize for breaking my promise and going 1 minute over our allotted time. Thank you again for the trust and for being here with me this morning. I look forward to seeing you next week for our final penultimate class on success. Have a good weekend. Bye.